welcome everybody. Welcome to camp. This is another edition of Urban Talks. I'm really excited today because I have two very good reasons. Tomorrow we are opening camp again. Government restrictions are okay for us to open, and we are really happy that you can visit us again. You can visit our exhibition. You can vote for your Prague priorities, priorities in Prague's development, and you can visit our library and visit our cafe. So we are looking forward to meet you again. And the second reason is that we have Beatrice Galilee here. Welcome, Beatrice, in camp. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great. Are you in New York right now?
I'm in Brooklyn, yes.
Great. I will just shortly introduce you. Beatrice Galilee is a New York-based curator, critic, and cultural consultant specializing in field of contemporary architecture and design. Her writings has been published in a number of international magazines and books, for example, Domus, Mark, Architecture Review, Riba Journal, and Wallpaper. And these are just a few of you can find in our library, but there are more and more. And she is the founder and director of the World Around platform, and her book, Radical Architecture of the Future, is being published in January next year. That's amazing. This amazing CV. I'm really happy that we have you here tonight. I'm really looking forward to your presentation, for your talk. So if you're ready to start, I will ask you for your talk.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to be here digitally. I wish I could be there in person. I love Prague and have had a great trip there last year. So this is actually the first time I'm speaking about my book. So I hope that everyone will have some patience. I may be reading some things out loud because, yeah, I haven't done this presentation before, especially for you guys. So to give a little bit of background about who I am and what I've been doing, that gives me the right to write a book about the future of architecture. I was a journalist and a writer in London for the magazine Icon. I trained as an architect, and then I went into the world of writing and criticism, and was working on basically a very high-profile magazine that was kind of pre-design. We had exclusives and interviews, and we were trying to frame what architecture was the most important of the time, and what was the most kind of interesting people, and how can we present architecture and design in a way that's very consumable and accessible and not academic, and that was really my sort of training, and I always mention this at the beginning because I feel like my training as a journalist really informs a lot of my curatorial work, and in the end what became my academic work. I went to become a curator in 2009, so more than 10 years ago. And the first exhibition I did was in China, and I lived in China for a year. And so my exhibition making and relationship to exhibition making was forged in this Biennale context, which, as anyone who's been to a Biennale may know, is like very hectic and very driven, and always based on the absolute cutting edge, often commissioning new projects and making things happen in very short periods of time under high pressure. But most importantly, there are urban events. They take place in cities. They are often rooted in a desire to create a certain sense of identity for the city. And specifically design biennales and architecture biennales always have this sort of a relationship that is in public space. And so I also began my curatorial career in that way, in public space, and in the Biennale in Shenzhen, commissioned projects in shopping districts in the city and out on the street. And this was really like the beginning of my working in the idea of exhibiting and activating architecture in public. And another biennale I did in South Korea was also a commission a series of commissions for the Gwangju Design Biennale in South Korea. And I started my own exhibition space in London called the Gopher Hole in 2010 that was based in this kind of underground space underneath a Mexican restaurant in East London in Old Street, where, you know, we were connecting and meeting and hosting, and some friends of mine, we would always organize these last minute talks and kind of create a sense of energy around the community of design and architecture in London. I also curated a biennale in Lisbon called the Lisbon Architecture Triennale, which was, again, a way of like activating unusual and less traditional forms of architectural practice. In Lisbon, in Portugal in general, there is a very kind of heavy tradition of the weight of like Caesar and Souto de Moura, and so the tradition of architecture there is, you know, it's I thought pretty kind of macho and male and heavy, and the idea of the Triennale was to kind of offer different perspectives and a different type of visibility for different other ways of practicing architecture. So we had a play, a kind of opera performance by Andres Hacker, which was celebrating queer identities, and had a kind of, the premise was to explore the in-betweens and the lesser known stories of architectural history and cultural history that have been erased over time. And we also commissioned young architects to create like restaurants and meals, and it was a very dynamic and, again, very, very public and very, very much for the public and not for the architecture community specifically. After that, I moved to the Met, where I also commissioned many projects, many installation projects, site-specific projects on the roof of the Met. This, on the top left, there is the artist, London artist Cornelia Parker, who made a replica of the Psycho barn, like the house from the movie Psycho, made out of red barn. And so I essentially was the curator on that project. So we worked together to create like a one-to-one replica of that house. But every single item of that installation is made from the dismantled materials of a red barn that we found in upstate New York. So the color and like every single aspect of that installation is reused and remade. And you can see in the second image on in the center that the whole thing is a set, a prop. And this was a really interesting way for me to access the relationship between art and architecture, how artists have really interesting and very visceral relationships to architectural practice, and very clearly see the relationship between, for example, a billboard as architecture and like this kind of signifiers of a haunted house just from the way the roof line is positioned, and why was this particular type of architecture from the history of architecture, why is this house always a haunted house, and why is a red barn always something that is a trope of like peacefulness and innocence. And so in combining these two things, the barn and the house, the sort of haunted house, this artist Cornelia Parker was able to create this kind of very powerful narrative on architecture as an image, architecture as a sign. I also worked with Wolfgang Tillmans, the photographer and documentary artist, on a film that he had commissioned as part of Rem Koolhaas's Biennale in Venice. And this was essentially 500 images that he had taken of architecture over the time, that he positioned and called it Book for Architects. And that was a really interesting piece that we acquired into the Metropolitan Museum of Art's permanent collection, partly because of this very special gaze that artists and particular photographers have on contemporary architecture and on architecture in its role in the world. So this is a little bit of I guess, just like a small background into where I come from. And I'm going to talk about, The World Around, which is my new project that is essentially a kind of platform for contemporary architecture. And we're holding our next event in January, you can see our website, theworldaround.com, and there are many films and short presentations that you can access there. So today I'm mainly going to be speaking about this book that I just completed called Radical Architecture of the Future. It is essentially like a kind of manifesto in a way of all of the architecture that I value and appreciate and admire the most of people I've worked with, of people and practices that I believe are very significant and meaningful. It is very much based on the type of public programming I have done, and it's based on a little bit what I was just speaking about, which is how artists and other types of practice influence architecture and influence the way I see architecture and the way that I think that architects often reflect on their own practice. The book's made of 5 different chapters, and I'm going to sort of just walk through some of the examples in each of these chapters and some of the types of practice that I think could represent the architecture of the future. And perhaps it's radical, perhaps it isn't, but in any case, it's something that I would love to hear from you and talk to you about afterwards. So the first chapter is called Visionaries. In a way, the question that this chapter asks is like, how do visionaries change spaces and inspire change without building? And so in this group of people, we're looking at architects or people or individuals who find ways to positively transform spaces by using unconventional and multifaceted techniques. So these practitioners, whether they're architects or otherwise, identify the complex needs and wants of individuals or communities and integrate them into the design process. They welcome the variety of ways in which architecture can contribute to society without building. For example, we'll see designers and researchers collaborating with a dance team or public performance artists to provide visibility for cultural traditions. An architect like Philippe Rahm, who alters the density of air in a public park to respond to a humid climate, and the indigenous heritage of a city situated through the colors and forms of a body of built work in the work of Freddy Mamani in Bolivia. So in a way, we find like architects, kind of academic architects, who use feedback loops between science fiction and real life to explore radical solutions to climate change and envision applications of near future technologies. There are various studios here that seek to address problems such as the climate crisis and the harmful impacts of industrial ocean farming, of wasteful material supply chains, and urban blight. So there are sometimes you'll see in this chapter like new business models or artistic interventions as a way to offer practical solutions. And those operating outside of the traditional realm of architecture set a new standard for how architectural training, when connected with other disciplines, could be applied to have a deeper impact on society. So in this chapter, architects and artists play a fascinating role, not as a finite structure, but as an interconnective matter that flows between the reality and potential of social spaces, individual lives, and materials. So in this, this is a work by Jill McGeed. It's called The Proposal, and this is a narrative that looks at how she in this project found a way to archive the history of Luis Barragan's archive through this ring. So again, I can't explain everything about this, but if you know the project, the artist Jill McGeed is using this ring as a way to kind of protest the history of Luis Barragan, the artist, the Mexican architect Luis Barragan. We have another artist here, John Gerard, who uses visual simulations to explore the history of a site. So this is a 24-hour simulation that looks at the original site of an oil, the first ever oil discovery in the US. So this is a 24-hour installation that replicates exactly space, which again is something really interesting, I think, for contemporary architects. Like, how do we visualize spaces? How do we formulate ideas around spaces? Somebody like Thomas Thwaites, who is a designer who has explored different ways of trying to empathize and use design as a way to better empathize with the planet. So this is him turning his hand to the idea of, like, what would it be like to experience life as another animal, in this case, a goat. So he designed these legs and arms for himself and a hat and helmet, and tried to kind of explore and visualize all of the different elements of becoming something else. Like, what would a radical way of empathizing with the world look like? There are artist groups such as cooking sections who have explored the idea of design as something that should be part of the food system, that design is not something that is isolated and separate from agriculture and from ocean health, and the way that we grow and take care of our food shouldn't be something that's sterile and separate, but something that is intrinsically related to the climate crisis, intrinsically related to the health of our habitats and our architectural systems. And their work explores, in this case, like sort of farming of oysters on the coast of Skye in Scotland. In the Insiders chapter, this is a chapter that looks at the major, let's say, famous architects who perhaps 10 years ago would have been making museums and becoming the front page of sort of magazines and newspapers. And in this chapter, we kind of ask, what did architects do next? Many people still believe the idea of, like, a famous architect can be a generator of economic success and positive publicity. But I think that as the term star architect start to fade into obscurity, many progressive businesses and institutions are, like, not really interested in finding an architect just on the name alone. They want to know, how does that architect address the climate crisis? They want to know, how does that architect address societal change? How does it promote excellence through more than just the building? And so many of the studios in this chapter I've looked at are people who take the original brief and subvert it or add it or augment it in some way. Like, what more can a roof be? What more can a wall be? What more can a park be? How can we honor every single aspect of this building through its material goals, through its brief? How can we intervene in the supply chain to make sure that we are aware of the labor involved in this project, that we take ethical decisions in relation to the material, the life of all of the materials in this project? And so the people in this chapter are not just architects, they're not just famous architects, but they're instigators and fundraisers and collaborators. They use their profile tactically to raise the bar. And so I think that we start to find a pressure on the notion of a star architect. Somebody like Bjarke Ingels, who many of you will know, took the opportunity of a power plant in the center of Copenhagen to create a new form of public space, using the roof line to become a public park and a kind of ski center and a mountain wall. They wanted to find a way to show through the building, like, what it means to recycle. This is a waste to energy plant, but how can this waste to energy plant be something that's celebrated, that has a dynamism, that has a relationship to the city? This is a project by Dilys Scofidio and Renfro in New York, where they famously designed the High Line, which is one of the most important public parks in the city, from a reused railway, an empty railway that they turned into a public park that now has 7 million visitors a year. which is more than the kind of around the same number as the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And one of the consequences of this building, of building this park, was that the area around the High Line became extremely gentrified. That the prices of land around the High Line became worth multiple millions, if not billions of dollars for certain proportions of land. And how does an architect like Dilys Scofidio and Renfrew respond to the fact that their own building generated and regenerated and gentrified almost without limit? And this project that was instigated by Elizabeth Diller, the director, was her way of trying to process and understand how the city has changed in that time. And so as an architect, she created an opera. So this image, as you can see, there are people singing. This is 1,000 citizens of New York, various different citizens of New York, from choirs and professional choirs and unprofessional choirs, singing an opera that was scripted and designed by Liz Diller in collaboration with musicians and poets. And so this is like architects finding a way to create a relationship with the city, be critical of themselves, and also try to move outside of the traditional realm of architecture. This is a project by Amateur Architecture Studio when in the area of Fuyang in China, in central China. When Amateur Architecture Studio won the Pritzker Prize, they received many invitations to create new museums in China, to create cultural programs and projects in China. And in this case, the architects were noticed that the area that the local government had asked them to build a new cultural center was also very close proximity to a village that had been extremely run down and was in great need of support and redevelopment. And so the architects took on the project on the basis that they would also receive the commission to support the rural village that had been extremely run down and had almost no investment. And so this was a case where the architects did get to design the big museum project, but they also created this relationship with the local environment so that the museum itself wouldn't be isolated, wouldn't be out of touch, but it actually even took cues from the material culture of the area. You can see the bricks and the tiles here were actually used from certain parts of the villages, and they use labor from the villages to give work to local people. And so this is what I mean by architects that think not just about the brief, but think about how to improve every single aspect of the design process so that it meets their goals, the goals of the client, the goals of the architect, and can be a sort of ethical, holistic project. This is an extraordinary project in Palestine. You can see that this is in the north of Palestine, and a project by Hennigan Peng to design a new museum there. While they created, you can see here in the plan, the building there at the south of the bottom of the image, at the top of the mountain, but not just the building, they also created this huge landscaping project. So from top to bottom, you can see there are many layers of gardens, and these are, they grow fruits, they grow local herbs, there are flower gardens, and actually the public space and the open space that this project created was not in the original brief given to the architects, but it's something that they decided to, again, give back to the city. And so again, like in this chapter, it's a way of looking at what more architects can do rather than just materialize the brief of the client. In the radicals section, we have probably more like we have many artists, writers, researchers, filmmakers. They sort of find ways to pollinate and propagate ideas and using images. So like, how can images and ideas form part of radical architectural practice? you'll see like kind of electrifying images in this section by fine arts photographers, filmmakers. There are very complicated, complex stories about racial identity, about abstraction using sculpture and painting that deal with very intense issues. But there are, for example, from talking about the movement of goods and peoples to civil rights, to a campaign for to prevent Brexit by Wolfgang Tillmans. So many of these practitioners are kind of part of a culture that it's about the post-occupancy of architecture. What happens when the architects leave? Artists reflect on that, on those abandoned buildings, on those cities, on those spaces. And so in the radicals section, we find many images. Some of them are based in imagination, some of them are completely fictional. We included in this section the production designer of the Black Panther, someone who created a city from scratch for a movie. And it's a way of just trying to think about how we could expand the idea of architecture to include other people. This is Andres Hacker, whose project here was looking at how Grindr, which is an app for like a gay dating app or a hookup app, how can Grindr be a sort of metric of gentrification for a city? Also, what is the agency of dating apps in terms of, for example, in countries where homosexuality is banned, what is the agency of Grindr? How can it be used to create safe spaces in urban places? How can it be used to protect people, to give advice, to share safe locations and safe spaces? But also, how can Grindr also indicate places that are up and coming? Let's say there's a metric where young gay men are indicating, where they live. Like, well, this is a great new neighborhood in New York, because they can look at all of the GPS data from the app. So different ways of thinking about urbanism through unexpected mediums and unexpected ideas, and how architecture should never really be disassociated from the digital sphere that we all live in. This is an extraordinary image by the artist Mishka Henna that looks at, is a very striking image that takes a little while to process, but essentially this is called feedlots. And if you look at the left of the photograph, you will see lots of vertical squares and tiny little white dots. And those white dots are cattle. And this is a ranch in Texas that provides beef to McDonald's and other industrial sort of distributors of beef. And so you'll see here, like, this is essentially the visuals of what we have, what industrial agriculture has done to the planet. This is on the left, that kind of green slurry is the consequences of all of the of the kind of sterilization of all of the offcuts from, and all of the what's the word, this kind of slurry from the process of killing and creating all of the meat that this place produces. So on the one hand, you see these extremely bleak conditions. There's no grass, there's no life. There is life, but there's these sort of doomed animals. And then on the left, we see really just a horrifying pollution that this land creates itself. So again, it's just a way of perhaps bringing life and visualizing some of these very complicated ideas that often we don't come face to face with. We also in this chapter look at artists and architects who create spaces and identities using dance or performance. This is a project by Mabel Wilson, and this is a commission from Storefront for Art and Architecture, which is an architectural institution in New York, and uses the idea of a drum line, which is a traditional musical kind of public space dance and drum line. So on one side you see the drums, and on the other side you see the dancers, and this is a way of creating visibility for young Black children in New York, to make them feel special, feel like their community and their culture is something that belongs in public space in New York. As you will have seen this year with the Black Lives Matter protests, Black children are not subject to the same access to public space as other people, and their relationship with the police and public space is extremely different. And so this project was designed to create a lot more visibility, and also was a whole kind of visual identity, creating new cloaks and new costumes for this performance group called the Cobras. Also look at the idea of like image making in architecture through this group called Design Earth. They basically create these types of fantastical drawings, like almost Victorian drawings and images that describe fantastical scenarios. In this scenario called Of Oil and Ice, they propose, Design Earth proposes to melt, to take icebergs that are melting in the Antarctic due to climate change, and instead of allowing them to melt to rise the sea levels in that area, they propose to move icebergs. I mean, this is a fantasy, but they propose to move the icebergs and take them to the Middle East, where in the Middle East, clean water and fresh water is a process that is extremely intensive and requires desalinization and requires processing. So to a place where there is no water, from a place where water is being created and melted due to climate change. We work with, present this project by Amanda Williams, who is an African-American artist and architect in Chicago, and this is a great project that she did that is on display at MOMA right now, where she uses abandoned houses that have been allocated for demolition, that have been abandoned, and she paints them colors that are identified with the African-American experience, the Black experience in in Chicago. Then the Breakthroughs chapter is a group of architects, I guess, that I would have worked with or would like to work with. And these are people that I asked, like, what are the values of the architects of the future? And so perhaps like over the last 100 years or so, the role of the architect has not always extended to the physical act of building. You don't think of architects as builders. You think of them as designers, and you hire a construction company or laborers to do the physical act of building. But in this chapter of Breakthrough Architects, I talk about how a new generation of practitioners put the process of making and the process of construction at the heart of their work. So they experiment with found materials. They look at the limits of brick, of bamboo, of marble. Some of them even grow hemp to make their own prefabricated materials for cladding. And so these are the sort of lateral-minded, pluralistic practices of future architects that perhaps will reshape the future of the discipline. There are renewal projects. There are projects that look at architecture as part of an ecosystem of regeneration, working with grassroots communities, working with working class communities, working with rural regeneration projects, working with urban regeneration projects, but always using skills and materials that come from the region. And so a little bit like with the insiders, the major architects, the breakthrough architects are taking responsibility for understanding the local environments of all of their projects. For example, the Sweetwater Foundation is a community project in Chicago that includes public spaces, but the public spaces also generate workshops and educational programs and agricultural programs for the public. The DNA, which is a studio in Beijing run by Xu Tiantian, she orchestrated the reconstruction of an entire city and village of a community of villages in Sonyang, which is an extraordinary project that she calls urban acupuncture, working with different parts of the community to restore faith, restore confidence in the people that live in these rural areas where many of the young people have already left to go to the cities, leaving a much older community there, an older generation who don't have access to the economic drivers that their grandchildren or children have. And then she works with communities to explain how to use e-commerce, how to sell your handmade tofu, how to create kind of cultural stories and sell things online, how to attract tourism, how to create hotels. And so it was an extraordinary and exciting project that she did there. And finally, in the masterminds section, this is an interesting, for me, it was exciting to be able to kind of include the idea of masterminds in a book about radical architecture, because this chapter looks at who are the radical thinkers that influence the future, the architects of the future. And so this chapter introduces the philosophers, scientists, filmmakers, artists, curators, and academics that are, in a way, rewiring the framework of mainstream architectural thinking. So whether they're writing books or building university curricula, their work and ideas have profoundly influenced and will continue to profoundly influence contemporary design theory and contemporary design discourse. And so they are challenging the status quo metaphorically, but also literally sometimes going underneath the surface to think about, what lies below technologies, like what are the physical infrastructures of technologies, or, for example, what are the relationships between non-human animals and human animals in the environment. So they kind of connect. Many of the most important thinkers of today highlight the interconnectedness between the current ecological crisis and other issues of global importance, such as poverty and war, issues of social justice. And all of these are issues that are arguably byproducts of the last 100 years of growth and wealth accumulation in Western societies. But the masterminds in this section address the inequalities by creating new alliances, often working at major universities. These are the people that their attitudes and their ideas inspire other thinkers and makers. And so even in this section, the institution of the university or the institution of academia is considered because in many ways the field of architecture is determined by the expense of education required to study to become an architect. And so the low starting salaries of architecture, the very slow career progression of architecture is in a way an obstruction to diversity in the discipline. And in this chapter, we look at a sort of decentralized educational models that could increase access and could be a new way to have more radical architects of the future. And so here in this chapter, we have the work of Dark Matter Labs, which is a studio in London, who, while they studied architecture and while they are architectural practitioners in many ways, they will be analyzing things like childhood education. So they've mapped an entire series of strategies to increase, to create better environments for young children from underprivileged backgrounds to learn. And these are the kind of issues, the future of rights. What would be, they ask provocative questions such as, should trees have rights? What would happen if all of a sudden all of the non-human animals in the world mobilized themselves and created a charter system where they had rights? What would happen if the Amazon had rights? Not to be too fantastic, but it is a very interesting direction of thought. The work of James Bridle, whose book, The Dark Age, I think it's called The Dark Age, The New Dark Age. James Bridle looks at what really is the role and responsibility of technology in relation to architecture and design. The University of the Underground is a new education program run by Nelly Ben Hayoun that was, as I was saying, considering new ways of accessing education that is untraditional, that happens at night, that happens in spaces that you don't expect, that can travel, that can offer no fees education for design, and would create a sort of provocative and exciting program of education. Also, we included this really fantastic video game by the designer David O'Reilly. And this is a really exciting project that talks about, if you have I don't know if anyone has a PS1 or if you buy this game, you have to go through the world of this game by occupying objects that are seemingly inanimate, but you have to basically create and think and imagine what it's like to be a rock or a atom or a star or a leaf. And in order to progress through the game, you have to create empathy and create connectivity between objects and your relationship to those objects. And so we included this in a book about architecture because, in a way, architects are constantly having to imagine and empathize experiences that they have not had, but perhaps they rarely think about the other aspects of the world that they can't empathize with. So the experience of a spider the experience of a mushroom in their building. And so it's a very interesting and thoughtful project that I included. So yes, I'm just going to wrap up by talking about the world around, which is happening. The next edition is happening in January, and our goals are to be a sort of new collaborative platform for design and ideas, much like Camp, and we'll be sharing our public programs coming up in the next year. So I look forward to your questions, and thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk. I will ask you, do you have a book there? Can you show us?
Oh, yeah. I do have a book. Hang on, I can't see you. Where are you can see it? Yeah.
Nice.
I have it here. Yeah.
Wow, it's beautiful. Oh, it's big. It's beautiful.
It's kind of, yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's like, it's not that big.
Yeah, it's great. It's really nice. I hope I will find it under my Christmas tree. It's really nice. Thank you so much for your talk. And I know we don't have much time left, so I will go quickly through my questions. I would like to ask you about curating public space. You've mentioned a High Line. It's a globally known park, globally known public space. It's the example for many cities, also Prague. We are transforming railway station, railway tracks in one district here, and High Line is, of course, our example, our inspiration. But in New York, you mentioned it's a source of massive gentrification. And is there any curator that that's focused on making it more more for average people, for not for tourists, but for locals? Is there someone like a curator for a High Line?
There is actually a curator for the High Line. They have a group called the Friends of High Line, and they have an art program, and they commission contemporary artists and filmmakers to create projects on the High Line. So that is also a kind of public program, and I know that they have a series of curators that organize events. They try to create models for investment so that the developers who purchase the land adjacent to the High Line also have to make ongoing contribution to the maintenance of the High Line and the charitable work of the High Line, which I think is an interesting model. That you can't get planning permission unless you commit to, investing into the public life of the park. So I think that's kind of an interesting way around, these kind of inevitable gentrification of these types of spaces.
Thank you. I guess that the gentrification is a problem in New York City, and I've seen that there are a lot of community programs or institutions like Van Allen Institute, Flatirony, which is focused on surrounding of the Flatiron building, or Brooklyn Army Terminal, which is focused on very lucrative buildings on Manhattan or on Brooklyn. Do you think that this gentrification situation is more challenging for these institutions, and we can expect that there will be more, like Flatirony or Brooklyn Army Terminal?
Yeah, what will happen after the COVID crisis here is unclear. I think that the gentrification may happen outside of the city now. I think that you see people leaving New York and finding ways to work outside of the city, which is quite interesting.
Is that true? I heard about that.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah. A lot of people have found that you can work online, and why would you live in New York if you could live somewhere further away that has outside space, and that is real, that's happening. But I think that the gentrification is something that, as I said, often the private public create some agreements, some partnership where if a developer is making a lot of money because of a cultural program, they have to support that cultural program going forward. And I think that developers are aware that they, in order to be successful, they have to be able to be part of the community. And so often in New York, you see collaborations between developers and public cultural projects, for example, arts projects, museum projects. There's sort of co-dependency perhaps there, but something that I think is a good, it's fair. I think it's fair that if they make money out of people wanting to be close to public cultural projects, they have to also invest and support them.
Yeah, I think that's another challenge for architects, because they spend a lot of time to designing buildings that we will be able to spend some time together, and now we are exploring the art of being alone somewhere in the middle of the forest. Do you think that the COVID situation globally is the next big thing in architecture, next big challenge for architects all around the world?
I think everybody has dealt with it very differently. I don't think there's a universal experience of the COVID situation. I think that the idea of public health as something that is a spatial problem is very interesting. I think circulation of air, people becoming much more cognizant of the quality of air, quality of space, quality of light in their homes, in their offices, having access to fresh air. These things are not inevitable in people's workplaces, having sterile surfaces, having a clean subway. So hopefully there will be some improvements in terms of public health after this. But yeah, I think that people's relationship to home is going to be the biggest change after this, especially, I don't know how it is where you are, but here people are not really expecting to go back to the office. There's going to be a lot of people very comfortable working from home, very comfortable working online, only really meeting in person for very special occasions. Maybe there will be a premium type of occasion where you would actually see someone in person. And so I think that people's homes are sort of like, it's not like that you're working from home, but you're like living at work. And so I think that is going to change the way that people consider their relationship to their immediate environment, their community. Here where I live in Brooklyn, the restaurants and the bookshops and the cafes are very busy because people are working here, not in the center of the city. So it has had some interesting repercussions.
Great. I have a question from one of our followers. It's can video games help designing places and spaces? That's a great question because I visited Highline only in video game division on Xbox. So, do you think that video games helps us to create better spaces?
I think it's a very interesting question. I think that, many architecture studios will create these virtual environments for designing that are similar to video games because of the I think that just the quality of technology and those types of software. But I think it's interesting, and to me the video game world combining with movies, combining with design criticism, it's very interesting. I think to me the most interesting aspect is the gaze, because I think that with a video game, perhaps you always have your own your view, but then you can occupy other people's positions and other ideas of that space. So perhaps early in video games it was like Gran Turismo, or you're like it's you versus the world and you're navigating the city. But when you can pull out and look more broadly and occupy other perspectives and think about, for example, in everything, think about what that building looks like if you're 5 years old. How does that office space feel? If you're, you can't move properly and you're slower, what is it like if you're physically, you have a disability? There are like some sort of visual impairment. I think video games have the capacity to give us those types of experiences that are not just our own experience. And I think that's could be a very profound way of designing.
Yeah, and do you think that video calls like Zoom, Skype, and other technologies can be a challenge for architects? Do you think that there's someone who is trying to design the better virtual space for meeting people? For example, me and my friends using Xbox instead of Zoom to meet each other. And I meet my colleagues every day during their little screens, and I can see their living rooms and their kitchens like I see your office. Do you think that this is better for us, or we should try something better? For example, like a second world or Sims or something like that?
Yeah, I really like these sort of Mozilla hubs.
Second Life, that's the platform.
Yeah, some of my friends are designing these Mozilla hub spaces. One of my friends designed a sort of plastic bag that you can occupy, and I was in there and I was a ghost and she was a robin, and she was sort of like bouncing around as a robin in the space. And and then eventually we just turned on the videos because I was like, I can't talk to you where you are the shape of a robin. But I very much liked the difference. I have to say, I find it in the summertime, I found this position that you have to be at your desk online in a Zoom call slightly disturbing, because really, I mean, I could be in the park on a phone, like I found it like, why do we have to do video calls? Can't we just do phone calls? Because why do you need to know, where I am? It seems mean. Let me be in the park, let me go for a walk and take my call, So And I'm all for improving this situation. Yes.
All right. And last question. You said that your book contains things you like or you admire. Do you think that you can explain someone what is great about architecture and turn him into architecture fan in one book?
I think so. I mean, it's not me, you know, it's of course the architects who, I think sometimes the problem with architecture is that it comes across maybe as complicated or austere or not fun or not easy. So yeah, I hope that just by compiling some of these great projects that are really fun, that are really interesting, that are super inspiring, and explaining them, I think, in a very clear, easy way. Yeah, I hope that I would love for people to feel that architecture is something that is open, you know, for anyone to access, that it's not something that is a precious discipline only for very well-educated people, but something that you can be part of if you're a game designer, if you're a big game player, you know. I think that would be great.
Okay, thank you very much, Beatrice, for joining us. Thank you for your talk, and I hope your book will be successful.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me.
And thank also to you for watching us. You will find that episode on YouTube or Vimeo, and I hope we will meet again in another episode. Goodbye.